Any of you who have been around on this channel for some time will know that I have a lot of love for Le Mans, the Group C era in particular, but in the earlier 90s, of course, Group C was forcibly phased out of the picture with more F1-derived technology, including engines, coming into play, and of course a lot of teams had great success with that. Peugeot, for instance, with the 905. Then, though, a new series came onto the scene, the BPR Championship. Mercedes at the time, though, was more involved in DTM, with a lot of success, even against the monster cars from Alfa Romeo and Opel. But then a lot of those larger teams started to drop out, and Mercedes began to look around to see if they could re-enter the GT sphere. Now that is not as simple a question as you might think. You'd probably assume, given their success, great drivers, great engineering, well, it's an obvious choice. Why not just enter? But the reason why was actually more of a moral one, because of course famously, the last time Mercedes was in GT competition at Le Mans was 1955, in possibly the most devastating crash in racing history, wherein of course an SLR crashed, exploded, its magnesium body caught fire. As far as I know, the engine and various other parts left the vehicle, ploughed through the crowd, and killed upwards of 80 people, and injured in excess of 180 people. It's infamous, as I said, so them going back into GT racing was no small thing. They decided ultimately that what they needed to do was look at the competition, as any good team would. And the interesting thing was, in the BPR, and more importantly in the emerging FIA GT Championship, which of course ultimately led to what many of us know better of the late 90s with the Porsches and Panhars and Mercedes, etc., they needed something good enough to win, but there were very different ways of getting there. McLaren, for instance, took a great road car and made relatively minor changes to turn it into a race car. Porsche, on the other hand, had technically a 911, but not really, the GT1, which was in effect a reverse-engineered prototype, almost like an earlier Group C or earlier 90s machine, with, again, great success. Two cars with fantastic abilities, the McLaren in BPR and now the Porsche in the FIA GT Championship, so Mercedes had to decide what they were going to go for, and crucially they had to make that decision in 6 months, because that's how long they had to develop the car. So here's where this car comes in, because what Mercedes decided to do was purchase a McLaren F1 GTR and turn it into a test mule for their vehicle. Now, testing a race car, of course, is an essential part of any program, but this is a pretty radical way of doing it. So what they did is they purchased a French team's car, a Liveries Competition 1996 McLaren F1 GTR, which itself had had a pretty decent amount of success. It came second, for instance, in the 4 hours of Monza, and they completely gutted the car. Now, you might be thinking, why did they choose the McLaren, a car which you could argue was already a couple of years down the line, over the Porsche, the latest and greatest and dominating thing? Well, probably for two reasons on the surface, but for more when you look into the technical side. One of the obvious reasons is you probably couldn't get your hands on a 911 GT1 without Porsche noticing, and also, on the engineering side of things, the McLaren was a perfect fit, because Mercedes, working of course with AMG, already had an engine ready to go, the M120 V12, codenamed the LS600 engine, tuned by AMG, 6-litre, 600 horsepower V12, naturally aspirated. They also wanted a car with a carbon monocoque chassis, and crucially they needed a test mule which could have interchangeable bodywork fairly easily to test their aero setup. Again, something which would have been potentially more difficult with the 911 GT1, given its body was pretty strict, let's say, in its structure. The McLaren, though, had already shown a propensity to having interchangeable bodywork. Long tail, short tail, road car, LM, everything in between. So that's what they went for. Plus, of course, the McLaren has a carbon monocoque chassis, and crucially, it already was fitted with a BMW V12 of around 6 litres as well, a 6.1, so fitting their own V12 certainly wouldn't be an issue. They already had a 6-speed sequential gearbox ready to go, so they moved ahead with the project. Now again, they had 6 months to make this happen. Fast forward to the testing phase, they took the car to the Jarama circuit in Madrid with a burnt Schneider behind the wheel, who himself was an ex-F1 driver, who had brought Mercedes a DTM championship in 1995, and he tested the car. This is where it gets really good, because testing that car, the in effect mule of a CLK GTR, which is exactly what it was, it did a 128 lap. Now without context, that doesn't mean very much, but that was 2 seconds quicker than the McLaren F1 GTR that had pole on that same circuit in the BPR series. 2 seconds on a circuit that only takes a minute and a half is a colossal difference. Now, ultimately, the car went through 4 days of on-track testing with minimal media coverage, ideally, of course, from Mercedes, but just as they were having some issues with overheating, Burnt actually crashed the car. Now, as far as I know, he wasn't injured, but the car itself was. Beyond repair, in fact. It wasn't worth it to get the vehicle going again at that time. But crucially, in those 4 days, Mercedes-AMG had learned pretty much everything they needed to know to move forward with the project. And move forward they certainly did, because of course the CLK GTR became a legend, certainly brought the heat to the Porsche 911 GT1, was later evolved into the CLK LM, and of course was superseded by the even more extreme-looking CLR. And of course, the GT1 program, if you will, of the FIA GT series in the later 90s was not without its own issues at Le Mans, of course Mercedes' famous flying CLRs. But be that as it may, the car served its purpose, and it served it well. Now you're probably thinking, what does McLaren think about this issue? Where is the car? Is it in a Mercedes museum, a McLaren museum? Well, interestingly, the answer is neither, because yes, it was crashed, beyond repair, but you can always restore a race car. That's the interesting thing. It was restored, but not to a Mercedes. It was restored, including the engine, and a yellow and black Lotus Elise GT1 style livery, to its original McLaren form. And then, in the year 2000, it showed up at Sotheby's and was sold to a British collector and later converted to a road-going McLaren F1 GTR. What an interesting story. A car which kind of exists, but also kind of doesn't anymore, which at the time certainly didn't get a huge amount of exposure. That was the whole point. But boy did it serve its purpose well. A car which was kind of brainwashed by the opposition and used as a test bed to make their own machine even better, and it's yet another occasion where the brilliance of the McLaren F1 was literally, in this case, drawn on to develop something great in its own right. Of course, Bugatti also looked at the McLaren F1. I believe Porsche did as well with the Carrera GT. It is one of the ultimate supercar benchmarks. And this particular machine went to show that even though it was a couple of years longer in the tooth than everything else, it was still more than enough of a capable test bed for Mercedes to develop the CLK GTR program. So I think this is one of the most literal definitions of an unsung hero, a car which did so much for Mercedes and yet doesn't really get any kind of recognition for that. Overall though, that is it for this episode. If you are new to Unsung Heroes, 2 things you need to know. One is, of course, there are tons of other episodes to watch with some crazy vehicles. And secondly, if you like this car, then you can jump over to the free Discord chat down below and actually vote on it if it's one of your favourite episodes. But until next time, I'll see you then. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.